So we've set the stage of how we deal with our fossil evidence. But we also have to place this fossil evidence within a larger historical framework to understand how our interpretation of the process of hominid evolution was affected by the order in which the fossils were discovered and the contexts in which they were discovered. So we need to be made aware of some biases that exist in the fossil record itself. And these include the fact that, first, the oldest hominid fossils that were discovered weren't immediately embraced as being members of the hominid family tree. And that stems from the time at which the earliest fossils were found, which came from the 19th century. So this is the historical nature of science. Remember, we can only build our explanations based on the evidence that we have at any given point in time. And we're starting in the 19th century because that's when the first fossil discoveries were made. And so here are some of the just inherent biases in this historical process. And that is that the remains of the different species that we had known to science in the 1800s came from species that, first of all, were not that old. They came from Homo erectus, which dated at 1.8 million to 300,000 years ago, and the Neanderthals, 200,000 to 35,000 years ago. Now, in an evolutionary framework, that's not very old at all. So these weren't ancient ancestors. They came from particular parts of the world. So Homo erectus came from Asia and the Neanderthals from Europe. And what's distinctive about these two species is not only are they not very old, and they are only from two parts of the world, they also are species that have relatively large brains and have very human-like features. And that feature of the large brain is something that people really latched onto at that time and saw as being our defining feature, the thing that really set humans apart. And the fossil record seemed to support this idea of big brains first. Our interpretations of the fossil record were also influenced by some cultural biases that existed in the 19th century. First, again, this idea of big brains and intelligence is something that was very appealing to the scientific community at that time and people in general. Which means there was a big resistance to any fossil material that exhibited any primitive features. Now remember, when we hear that term primitive, it's referring to ancestral features, which would mean features that look more like what we would expect the last common ancestor between humans and apes to have exhibited. And since that last common ancestral population gave rise to both the ape lineage and to the hominid lineage, we would expect that there had to have been some characteristics of both. And the thinking at the time was the further back in time you went, the more primitive or ape-like those features might look. So big resistance to this idea that humans ever exhibited any primitive features, since the fossil species we had at that time were clearly very human-like in appearance and with large brains to boot. Another big cultural resistance to fossils that were found outside of Asia and Europe was that the idea that humans originated in Africa was not very appealing to people, culturally speaking, because it just was considered to be backward and underdeveloped, whereas Asia and Europe seemed like much more acceptable, culturally acceptable candidates for the rise of the noble Homo sapiens. And this bias continues, I think, even until this day, which is that humans are really viewed as being something so entirely unique, not just culturally, but also biologically. And of course, this class is really all about placing us within that larger biological context to understand how we are not separate or apart from nature. We exist within nature and are subject to the same exact biological and natural processes as other living things. Now, culturally, we definitely stand apart from all other living things, and there's a point in our evolution where we make some really important turning points that lead to these developments that do make Homo sapiens very unique and yet still connect us to this evolutionary process. We also need to account for where the fossils were actually preserved and uncovered, because conditions are very different in East African sites as opposed to South African sites, which is where most of the most ancient material comes from. And so because of the differing conditions in these two geographical locations, they require a different set of methods, and it also affects the way in which the fossils were preserved. So all of these factors have to be taken into consideration as the fossils are uncovered and examined and interpreted. Our task now is to determine which of these ancient fossils could be our earliest bipedal ancestor. And remember, we have to look for skeletal evidence of bipedality in order to make that determination. So to give you a sense of the geological time frame here and the evolutionary time frame, the earliest representatives of our lineage lived at the end of the Miocene and the beginning of the Pliocene epoch. So this is around 6 to 4.5 million years ago. The Miocene is known as the golden age of the apes, and at that time there were more than 20 different, not species, but genera of what are now extinct apes in the old world, but especially concentrated in East Africa. And of course today we have only 6 great ape species. So the history of the primates and of the hominids is a story of diversity. So it shouldn't be surprising that as we visit our evolutionary past, that you're going to encounter a lot of different species, and there's this process of diversification that's going on. But it's during this time, in the end of the Miocene, that a distinct type of primate appears. And although it is similar in brain size and activity patterns and even life history to that of modern chimpanzees, it does something that no ape does, and that is walk upright. So it's best to think of hominid evolution as a series of adaptive radiations. And we've talked about what that means when we dealt with the primates and how they spread out and diversify and move into different environmental niches. And yet we have to keep in mind that despite the anatomical and behavioral differences between modern apes and humans, we should remember that both lineages are derived from a common ancestral population, or gene pool. This means that we can expect the last common ancestor to exhibit features or characteristics of both lineages. That is, there should be some ape-like features and there should be some human-like features present in that gene pool. But don't forget what causes the phenotype, the physical observable characteristics that we see, our genes. So here we can really appreciate and understand the evolutionary significance of the fact that we are 99% genetically identical to chimps. We are linked by our shared ancestry, by our common genes from a common ancestor. And this also helps us to understand how evolution is like an ever-branching tree. The base or the trunk of the family tree is the population that we call the last common ancestor. And the first branching or divergence or adaptive radiation of the hominids had 2 main limbs. One limb led to the ancestral generalized chimpanzee, like apes, which eventually split into its own 2 branches, one leading to modern chimps, the other to modern bonobos. And another limb that led to the diversity of early hominid species. So after these 2 lineages split from the last common ancestor, each group continued to evolve and adapt to its respective environment with different selective pressures and evolutionary processes, including mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow operating on each. You see in that one sentence, I basically covered all of the material we've learned about in this class so far, all of the processes associated with evolution. And this is why there are still apes today. Natural selection has shaped their adaptations to an arboreal forest environment. But this is precisely the environment in which the early bipeds evolved too, which makes our task really difficult. Our ability to find distinctive hominid characteristics becomes really challenging because of these similarities. So this process of adaptive radiation or evolutionary diversification means that the farther back in time we go, the features we associate with modern or more recent hominids will become less distinctive and more similar to the members of related lineages. And this is precisely the nature and pattern of natural selection, which means what should an early hominid look like? How would we recognize it? This is further complicated by the fact that the evolutionary process is not this steady progression, unilineal, just one-directional progression towards more modern-like features, but rather this pattern of mosaic evolution, where we see different features developing at different rates and in different places. So the hominids exhibit quite a bit of variation, and they represent this pattern of mosaic evolution. It's not like we get modern features, the kinds of characteristics that we associate with modern humans or more recent hominid ancestors arriving in one package. It's these little bits and pieces like a mosaic that are pasted together, and it's really showing us natural selection, weeding out traits that aren't advantageous and continuing to build upon traits that do provide an adaptive advantage. We begin with the first adaptive radiation of the hominid, which occurs in the late Miocene around 6 to 7 million years ago. And it's during this time that we have a potential group of last common ancestors, meaning the fossil remains that come from this time period could represent what that last common ancestor looked like. We'll have to determine whether they exhibit that key hominid characteristic of bipedality, and that may not be available on some of these species. But one of the interesting things is that bipedalism seems to have emerged in a much more forested environment than we previously thought. And again, this is the process of science, the nature of science, where we're constantly being challenged to rethink what we thought we knew based on new evidence. And in this case, the evidence of bipedal ancestors living in a forested environment tells us that, in contrast to the idea that bipedalism emerged once the trees and the forests receded and the grasslands and the savannas opened up and required hominids to travel longer distances to find shade and shelter in the trees, it appears that bipedalism and this upright posture were already developing in the trees and led to being advantageous once the savannas opened up. This is the oldest possible hominid species, and it's actually a relatively recent discovery. It's called Sabelanthropus tchadensis, and its name comes from the region in which it was found, which is in the Sahel part of Central Africa in the country of Chad. Dated at 7 million years old, it is the oldest, and again I say possible because we still need to determine bipedality. You can see from the visual that it's a nearly complete cranium. We have the face, the brain case, and what it exhibits is this mix of human and ape-like characteristics, including a very small brain case, which is much more ape-like. In fact, this would be the smallest brain case and brain size of any hominid. These very robust features like heavy brow ridges and a crest in the back, which we're going to see is something that appears in a distinct group of hominids later down the line. And although the lower jaw is missing, we can tell because of that crest of bone on the back that it had a very large jaw, because that's where those muscles that control the jaw are anchored. And yet, despite these kind of robust and more primitive features, in the dentition, it's got a reduced canine. Now, that's not an ape-like feature. And it's got a small, pretty much flat face. So this is a very interesting mix. Again, it's exhibiting this mosaic pattern of evolution. But because we can't determine where the position of that foramen magnum is, and because we don't have any postcranial skeletal remains, there's no way to determine whether or not this is actually a hominid. But if it turns out that it is, it could very likely be a very strong candidate for being the last common ancestor. This next species is called Orrorin tugenensis, otherwise known as Millenium Man, because it was discovered in the year 2000 and made public in 2001. And it comes from Western Kenya, so we're still in Africa. And it's dated at 6 million years old. So again, this is a pretty old ancestor. There's just a bunch of fragmentary remains, as you can see in the visual. There's not much to it. But the discoverers are going to make some very interesting claims about this species. Because we don't have any of the cranial material, we can't really determine the size of the brain or any of the facial features or characteristics. But here are some important things to know about Orrorin. And that is that based on the shape of the leg bones, and particularly the femur, the thigh bone, there is some evidence of bipedality and some strong upper arm bones that indicate that there's still some adaptations for arboreal living. Yet, in the dental and some other skeletal features, they're more human than ape-like. And so that is an interesting combination in a fossil that's nearly 6 million years old. You would expect there to be more primitive or ancestral-like features, not human-like features. In fact, more similar to humans than other species that are a bit younger. So that raises some very interesting questions in the video that you'll be watching about Orrorin. We'll document this in much more detail. The next adaptive radiation occurs in the early Pliocene, and this is around 4 to 5 million years ago. And here we see a new species and in fact a new genus that evolves during this time frame. And once again, it's evolving in this very dense forested environment. All of the species that come from this time frame exhibit bipedalism, and that right there makes them established hominids. They also represent a challenge to this idea of the savanna hypothesis that dominated our understanding of the evolution of bipedalism in the past. And again, the video on Orrorin will go into more detail about this. Just a heads up, when I'm talking about this species that you're going to meet here, you'll hear me referring to Lucy or Australopithecus afarensis, which is a species of hominid that's been known to science for a very long time. The Australopithecines as a group are the most well-studied, well-documented group of hominids, and so we have to sort of use them as our basis of comparison for these finds that came after them. Ardipithecus ramidus is a more recent find, and so that's why in the visual that you see here, the left-hand side is the skeleton of Lucy species, afarensis, and on the right-hand side is the comparison with the remains of Ardipithecus ramidus. So I just wanted to prepare you for that because you'll hear me referring to Lucy as a basis of comparison in these slides. Meet Ardipithecus ramidus. This species represents the oldest established bipedal hominid and is the most complete ancient hominid skeleton that we have from the fossil record. When you see a change in genus name, that is, from Australopithecus to Ardipithecus, what that's telling us is that we can expect to see different adaptations, different characteristics, enough differences to warrant classifying these fossil remains as separate from and distinct from the known Australopithecines. As you can see, Ardipithecus ramidus has a mix of both ape-like and human-like characteristics. Now this is interesting because at the time that Lucy was discovered, her very ape-like characteristics, appearing in the fossil record at around 3 to 4 million years old, suggested or was hypothesized that the further back in time you went, the more ape-like or primitive our ancestors would look. However, we're discovering that there were human-like characteristics that were present even further back in time. So it's challenging that conventional model, but it makes sense based on how we know natural selection works. It can't produce entirely new features. It has to work with and select for characteristics that already exist from the genetic variation present in the populations. So, these human-like characteristics had to have been present in order for natural selection to select for these and continue them in the hominid lineage. Ardipithecus ramidus is important in hominid evolution for a number of reasons. First, this species is 1 million years older than Lucy's species, Afarensis, which for at least 2 decades was the oldest hominid species that had been discovered. Pushing back hominid origins and bipedalism 1 million years in time is pretty important, because it's also getting us back closer to that common ancestral population. And so ramidus represents the closest established hominid to that common ancestor we shared with modern-day chimps. Finally, this mosaic pattern of evolution, where we see a mix of traits and characteristics evolving at different rates and at different times in different places, is exhibited by ramidus in its arboreal and bipedal adaptations.